I've spent most of my 67 years being practical. My late husband used to say that about me, not as a compliment. Exactly. But not as a criticism either. Just a fact. The way you'd say the sky is gray on a November morning in Knoxville. Margaret is practical. She thinks before she feels. She measures twice before she cuts. That's what 31 years as a licensed pharmacist will do to you. You learn to read labels carefully. You learn that what something promises on the outside isn't always what it delivers on the inside. You learn that a wrong dose of the right thing can still kill you. I wish I had applied that lesson to my own family a little sooner. My son is 34 years old. His name is Daniel, and for most of his life, he has been the best part of mine. After his father passed, Daniel was 22 then, just finishing his business degree at UT. It was the two of us holding each other up. We sold the big house on Whitmore Drive and split the proceeds the way my husband had wanted. I kept enough to buy a small condo and pad my retirement. Daniel used his share to pay off his student loans and start his life. I was proud of him. I want to make sure I say that clearly, because what comes later might make it seem like I was always blind to his faults. I wasn't. I just loved him the way mothers do, with a kind of faith that sometimes outpaces the evidence. He met his wife 3 years ago at a work conference in Nashville. She was sharp, well-dressed, and she had a way of speaking that made everything sound like a decision that had already been made. I noticed that early. I told myself it was confidence. I told myself I was being unfair because I was protective of my son. I told myself a lot of things in those first months that I have since stopped believing. They got married 14 months after they met. Small ceremony. A Thursday afternoon in September. The kind of wedding that feels rushed only in hindsight. Now, I'm not the kind of mother-in-law who makes trouble. I have friends who are that kind. And I have watched the damage they cause. I kept my distance. I came when invited. I did not call every Sunday unless Daniel called first. I did not offer opinions about the apartment they rented or the furniture they chose or the fact that they ate takeout 5 nights a week. I believed, an easy mother-in-law to have. But there was something my son had always dreamed about that I knew about, because he had been dreaming about it since he was 9 years old and used to stand on a step stool in our kitchen, watching me make biscuits on Saturday mornings. He wanted to open a restaurant, not a chain, not a franchise, a real restaurant. Southern food done properly. The kind of place where the cornbread comes out in a cast iron skillet and the sweet tea is made from scratch. And you feel, when you sit down, like someone's grandmother actually cooked for you. He had talked about it his whole life. He had notebooks full of menu ideas. He had a name picked out since college, Whitmore's, after our old street, after his father. The dream had just never had the money behind it. About 8 months ago, Daniel called me on a Tuesday evening, and his voice had that particular energy it gets when he's been thinking about something for a long time and finally decided to say it out loud. He told me he had found a location, a corner property in the Bearden neighborhood, good foot traffic, close to the university, a space that had been a restaurant before, so the kitchen infrastructure was already in place. The lease was reasonable. He had done the numbers. He had a business plan. What he needed was startup capital. $240,000. I sat with that number for a moment. I want to be honest about what happened inside me when he said it. There was fear. Of course there was fear. That was most of what my retirement looked like, not extravagantly, but enough. Enough to cover the rest of my life without being a burden to anyone. Enough that I could take the occasional trip and not count every grocery item. But there was also something else. Something that felt, if I am being truthful, like purpose. Daniel was my son. Whitmore's was his father's legacy and name. And the honest truth was that I was 67 years old, in good health, living alone in a condo that was too quiet, and I had more money sitting in accounts than I had any particular plan to spend. I called my financial advisor the next morning. We went through the numbers carefully, the way I had always done everything. If I invested $240,000, I would still have enough to cover my living expenses and maintain an emergency cushion. It would be tight. There would be no more trips, no more little luxuries, but it would not leave me destitute. I told Daniel yes. I want you to understand what that yes meant. It was not a gift. We made that clear from the beginning, or at least, I thought we had made that clear. I hired a business attorney, a woman named Patricia, who had handled small business contracts in Knoxville for 20 years and had a reputation for being thorough. She drew up a partnership agreement. My $240,000 would give me a 40% ownership stake in Whitmore's. Daniel and his wife would hold the remaining 60% together. They would run the day-to-day operations. I would be a silent partner, available for advice if they wanted it, present for major decisions, but not in the kitchen, not behind the counter, not in their way. Daniel read through the agreement. His wife was in the room. I remember she sat very still while Patricia explained each clause, and she did not ask many questions. At the time, I thought she was simply trusting Daniel to handle it. I know now that is not what was happening. They both signed. I signed. Patricia notarized. I wrote the check that same afternoon. The next 4 months were the most energetic I had felt in years. I am not ashamed to say that. I wasn't supposed to be involved in the operations, but Daniel called me almost every day during the build-out. What did I think about the paint color? Did I know a good linen supplier? Could I taste the biscuit recipe and tell him if the butter ratio was right? I drove over to the Bearden space twice a week. I brought coffee. I sat on an overturned bucket and watched contractors install the kitchen hood and told Daniel stories about his father and how proud he would have been. His wife was rarely there during those months. I noticed it. I did not comment on it. The grand opening was set for a Saturday in late April. Daniel had done everything right: social media, a mailing list, a write-up in a local food blog, a soft opening the week before for friends and family that had gone beautifully. There was real buzz around Whitmore's, real anticipation. The morning of the grand opening, I woke up at 5:30 without an alarm. I put on my good blue dress, the one I wear when I want to feel capable. I made myself a real breakfast instead of just toast, because I knew it was going to be a long and wonderful day. I drove to Bearden with the windows down even though it was still a little cool, because everything felt like it deserved to be celebrated. I arrived at 9 o'clock, 2 hours before the doors opened to the public. The parking lot was already half full of staff vehicles. I could see through the front windows that the lights were on inside, the tables set, someone moving in the kitchen. I went to the front door and tried the handle. It was unlocked. I stepped inside. The dining room looked beautiful. Dark wood tables, mason jar light fixtures, a chalkboard menu on the far wall with Daniel's handwriting. I recognized his handwriting from all those years of helping him with homework. The smell coming from the kitchen was everything he had promised it would be. His wife was standing near the host stand. She saw me come in, and something crossed her face that I cannot describe except to say it was not welcome. I smiled at her. I said good morning. I asked where Daniel was. She said he was in the back. I started to move toward the kitchen, and she stepped slightly to the side, not blocking me exactly, but enough. She said, and I remember this precisely because I replayed it many times afterward, "Margaret, we actually wanted to talk to you about today." I stopped. Daniel came out of the kitchen a moment later. He was wearing an apron, his hair a little wild, the way it always got when he was excited or nervous. He looked at me, and then at his wife, and I saw something pass between them, a look that told me this conversation had been practiced. He said, "Mom, I'm really glad you came." I said I wouldn't have missed it for anything. There was a pause that lasted too long. His wife said, "We've been thinking, and we feel like today really needs to be about us, about our vision, about Whitmore's as our place, and we think it would be better for everyone if you weren't here for the opening." I heard the words. I processed them, the way you process something that doesn't make sense, the first time going over them again, checking for a different meaning. I looked at my son. He looked at the floor. I said, "I'm sorry you're asking me to leave?" His wife said yes, and she said it gently, the way you'd say something you've rehearsed saying gently. She said guests would be asking questions, and they didn't want to have to explain the partnership structure, and it would be confusing to have me there. She said it wasn't personal. She said they were grateful for my investment, and that they'd handle everything from here. I stood there in the dining room of the restaurant I had paid for, under the light fixtures I had helped pick out, and I felt something I can only describe as the ground going soft beneath me. Not falling, just the certainty that had been there suddenly not being there. I asked Daniel directly. I said, "Is this what you want?" He said, "Mom, it's just today. It's just the opening." I left. I drove home slowly, which is not how I usually drive. I sat in my condo parking lot for about 15 minutes before I went inside. I did not cry yet. The tears came later. Around 8 that evening, when I saw a photo on social media, Daniel and his wife behind the host stand, arms around each other, Whitmore's grand opening, 57 likes in the first hour. They looked so happy. I turned my phone face down on the coffee table and I sat in the dark for a while. The next morning I called Patricia. I want to say something about what happened in the days that followed, because I think it matters for understanding everything else. I did not call Daniel in anger. I did not send a long emotional message. I did not post anything on social media, or call mutual friends, or do any of the things a person does when they want to make a scene. I am 67 years old, and I have lived through enough to know that the decisions you make in the first wave of pain are usually not your best ones. Instead, I asked Patricia to pull out our partnership agreement and walk me through it again. She did. I asked her 2 specific questions. 1. What were my rights as a 40% owner? 2. What would happen if Daniel and his wife were to take on operating expenses or debts without my written authorization? Patricia answered both questions. She was very clear. I thanked her and told her to be available over the next few weeks. I had a feeling we were going to need her. I also, quietly, contacted a friend of mine named Ruth, who had owned a small catering company for 15 years before selling it. I asked her to explain to me exactly how restaurant cash flow worked in the first 60 days. She walked me through it over 2 evenings, patiently, with a yellow legal pad and a lot of coffee. What I learned confirmed what I had suspected. Whitmore's had opened beautifully. The reviews online were warm, but a restaurant opening well and a restaurant being financially stable are 2 different things, and the gap between them is where most new restaurants die. In the first 2 months, costs run high, full staff payroll, inventory ramp up, unexpected repairs, marketing, revenue, even good revenue, rarely covers it immediately. You need a cash reserve. You need to not be spending more than you're bringing in while you're still building your customer base. I knew what our capital structure looked like. I had seen the budget. I waited. 11 days after the grand opening, my phone rang at 7:45 in the morning. It was a Saturday. I was in the middle of my second cup of coffee. It was Daniel. His voice was different from the last time he'd called, not the excited, nervous energy of before. Something stripped down, something younger sounding, somehow, the way people sound when they've run out of the performance of being okay. He said, "Mom, we have a problem." I said, "Tell me." The problem, as he explained it, was the walk-in refrigerator. It had failed 3 days after opening a compressor issue that the building inspection had not flagged. The repair cost was $11,000. They had paid it because they had to. Because you cannot run a restaurant without a working walk-in. But it had wiped out most of their operating reserve. Then, 2 days ago, their primary food supplier had flagged their account. Apparently, Daniel's wife had set up the vendor account without reading the payment terms carefully, and they had missed a payment window. The supplier had put a hold on their deliveries. Without deliveries, they could not open next weekend, and their weekend bookings, they had a private event. A retirement party for 40 people were the revenue they were counting on to make the following month's payroll. Daniel said, "I need $50,000, Mom, just to get us through the next 6 weeks until we stabilize." I put my coffee cup down very carefully on the counter. I said, "Daniel, I need to ask you something first. When you and your wife asked me to leave on opening day, was that a decision you made together, or did she make it?" Silence. I said, "I'm not asking to be cruel. I'm asking because I need to understand who I'm in business with." He said, quietly, that it had been her idea, but that he had agreed to it. I said, "And when you agreed, did you think about what that meant? Did you think about the fact that I had invested my retirement savings into this place? That I had given you everything I had extra to give, and that the same week it opened, you asked me to leave like I was a stranger off the street?" He didn't answer right away. I said, I'm going to need a few days. Don't contact any new lenders or take on any new debt until we've spoken. Do you understand? He said yes. I called Patricia that same morning. What I had Patricia do over the next 3 days was something I had been quietly preparing for since the day I sat in my parking lot. I had her review every document, every authorization, every decision that had been made since the partnership agreement was signed. What she found was not criminal, but it was not nothing, either. Several vendor contracts had been signed by Daniel's wife alone, without my co-authorization, as required by our partnership terms for commitments above a certain threshold. The walk-in repair had been paid from a joint business account without my knowledge. A catering equipment lease had been quietly added to the business expenses that had not been in the original budget we had agreed to. None of it was fraud. All of it was the behavior of someone who had decided the agreement was a formality. Patricia said we had grounds to renegotiate the terms of the partnership, or, if I chose, to trigger the buyout clause. I sat with that for a full evening. I want to be honest about what that evening was like, because it would be easy to tell this story as though I was calm and certain throughout. I was not. I sat in my kitchen, the same kitchen where Daniel had learned to make biscuits, and I thought about his father, and I thought about what it meant to be the kind of mother who holds her ground, and I cried again. Not from weakness. I think from grief for the version of this story where none of this had happened, where my son had grown into someone who would never have allowed what happened on that opening day to happen. But grief is not the same as surrender. And by the time I went to bed, I knew what I was going to do. I called Daniel the next morning. I told him I would not be providing the $50,000. He was quiet for a long time. Then he said, "Mom," I said, "let me finish, please." I told him that Patricia had reviewed the partnership agreement and found several instances where decisions had been made without my authorization, as required by the terms we had all signed. I told him that, as a result, I had two options under the contract. The first was to renegotiate the partnership terms, to include tighter governance, meaning every financial decision above a certain amount required my explicit written approval. The second was to exercise the buyout clause, which would require them to either purchase my 40% stake at fair market value or allow me to sell it to a third party. I told him he had 2 weeks to decide which option he wanted to pursue. He said, "You're going to take away the restaurant?" I said, "I'm not taking anything. I'm asking to be treated like the partner I am. What I will not do is give you another $50,000 so that the two of you can continue making decisions without me, while I sit at home, wondering whether I'll have enough money to retire on." Another long silence. He said, "She said you were going to do something like this." I said, "Did she also say you should have asked me to leave on opening day?" He didn't answer. I said, "Daniel, I love you. That has not changed, and it will not change. But I gave you everything I had extra to give. I sat on a bucket in that empty building and talked to you about your father for 4 months. And on the day it mattered, you looked at the floor." I heard him breathing. I said, "Call me when you've decided." The 2 weeks that followed were not easy. Daniel called twice with a mediating tone, trying to find a middle ground that didn't require either a real accountability conversation or a real legal process. His wife did not call at all. Patricia received one inquiry from their side asking about the timeline for the buyout valuation, which told me they were at least taking it seriously. I went about my life. I took a long walk every morning. I had lunch with Ruth twice. I started making biscuits again on Saturday mornings because it occurred to me that I had stopped somewhere in those 4 months of construction and excitement, and I missed it. On the 14th day, Daniel came to my condo. He came alone. He sat at my kitchen table, and he looked tired in a way that had nothing to do with the restaurant. He looked like someone who had been having hard conversations in a house where hard conversations don't usually happen. He said, "She doesn't want to renegotiate. She wants the buyout." I said, "Okay." He said, "Mom, I'm sorry." I looked at my son for a moment, really looked at him, the way I hadn't let myself do since the opening day, because it had hurt too much. I said, "I know you are." I said, "I need you to understand something, though. I'm not doing this to punish you. I'm doing this because I gave you everything I could afford to give, and the response was to exclude me from the day I had spent 4 months helping build. And I cannot fund a situation where I am treated that way. I can't, Daniel. Not at this point in my life. He nodded. I said, "You're going to have to find a way to stabilize the cash flow. Patricia will work with your attorney on the buyout valuation. I'm going to be fair. You know, I'm always fair, but I'm going to be paid what my stake is worth." He said, "I don't know if we can afford it right now." I said, "Then you may need to find an investor or take on a loan. Those are hard things, but they are the things people do when they are actually running a business." He left about an hour later. I stood at my kitchen window and watched his car pull out of the parking lot, and I felt something I didn't expect. Not satisfaction, exactly. Not relief, something quieter than either of those. It took me a moment to recognize it. It was the feeling of having told the truth. The buyout process took 6 weeks. Patricia was thorough, as she always is. The fair market valuation came in at $218,000, slightly less than my original investment, which is the nature of a restaurant in its first 90 days. I accepted it without argument. I was not there to squeeze them. I was there to be made whole. The wire came through on a Tuesday afternoon. I sat with my laptop open, watching the number appear in my account, and I thought about everything that $218,000 represented. The years of 12-hour shifts, the holiday weekends I worked so my younger colleagues could be home with their families. The careful, boring, responsible decades of saving. I had it back. Whitmore's is still open. For now. I don't follow them on social media anymore. But Ruth drives past that neighborhood sometimes and gives me reports. She says the food is good. I already knew that. I helped make the biscuit recipe. Daniel and I talk on the phone about once a month. It is not what it was. I think we both know that, and I think we are both, in our own ways, grieving that. He does not bring up his wife, and I do not ask. We talk about other things. He asks how I'm feeling. I ask about the restaurant. We are careful with each other in the way that people are careful when they know they are standing on ground that has shifted and hasn't settled yet. I think it may settle eventually. I have not closed that door. But I have also not forgotten what I saw on his face when his wife asked me to leave, the way he looked at the floor instead of at me. I have turned that moment over many times, looking at it from different angles, trying to find in it something other than what it was. I haven't been able to. What I have found instead is something I didn't expect to be looking for at 67. I have found out what I am made of when I am pushed. I have found out that practicality is not the opposite of love, that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is hold the line, even when the person on the other side of it is someone you would have done anything for. I make biscuits on Saturday mornings now. The kitchen is quiet. The condo is small. The account that carries my retirement is not what it was before all of this. But it is enough, and it is mine. And no one is going to ask me to leave it. That's not nothing. At 67, after everything, that is actually quite a lot. I've spent most of my life being practical, and it turns out I was right to be.